As we've been highlighting, this recovery has been chugging along here, perhaps losing some steam over the last few jobs reports, as well as the other economic updates we've got. And now Yelp is publishing some worrying data here that shows a 23% increase since mid-July in the number of businesses on Yelp that have permanently closed. According to the company, permanent closures reaching 97,966, close to 98,000 here, representing about 60% of closed businesses that won't be reopening. And that number could rise here the longer some of these restrictions remain in place. And here to discuss that with us is Joel Hyatt. He's the CEO and chairman of Globality, a company backed by SoftBank's Vision Fund here, an AI-powered platform to promote economic inclusion here by matching smaller businesses, the ones that are struggling with some bigger Fortune 500 companies, to meet some service needs. And Joel, I mean, when we talk about what we're seeing play out, that would obviously be worrying because, I mean, we've talked so much about how these businesses struggle week to week and how they can't really last that long when your savings and safety net built up is not that strong. So talk to me about how some aid here is important to get back into the system to really support these businesses.
Well, look, there's no question about it. Small businesses have been hit by far the hardest in terms of the economic impact of the pandemic. And look, these small businesses are the backbone of our country. I mean, every single one of us depends every single day on lots of small businesses that provide goods and services to us. And we as a society, really, we need to provide help to these folks who have really been hit hard by something that, you know, was of no fault of their own. And there's a role to be played here by public policy, by big business that can purchase goods and services more from small businesses, by policies that foster entrepreneurship. Because, you know, my view is, you know, the pathway to the middle class in the United States for the 50 years following World War II were manufacturing jobs, good manufacturing jobs. But now the pathway to the middle class is the services sector. And in the future, it's going to principally be small and mid-sized services firms that are going to create the good jobs and create the pathway to the middle class, create economic growth. But that's the sector hit so very, very hard by this pandemic. And we have to do more across the board to assure their recovery. A lot of these companies, Zach, aren't coming back that have failed. You know, the same bars and the same restaurants won't open. Their owners have given up. They've gone somewhere else. They've taken on other opportunities to make some money in the meantime. Yeah. But that doesn't mean there won't be new bars, new restaurants, new small businesses. And that's what we have to assure in order to have the kind of economic recovery that we need to have.
Well, I guess that would be the big question, is if those new businesses come in, because as we've talked about, this kind of V-shaped recovery that a lot of people were talking back in March didn't necessarily play out the way that a lot had hoped, because those hard-hit sectors you're talking about, the service sectors, restaurants, bars, a lot of them maybe have remained closed through all this. At least that's the case here in New York City. But when you think about those businesses closing, it's certainly a lot harder to get people jobs here when those businesses have closed permanently and don't have a chance of reopening. And there's going to be a bit of a lag time before maybe those newcomers here, the new businesses you're discussing, can come in and open.
Look, no question. You know, wishful thinking is not going to provide the recovery. We can pray for a V-shaped recovery all we want. That's not going to be sufficient. We're going to have to take hard decisions that have real world impacts. You know, Governor Phil Murphy took one of those decisions yesterday, it seems to me. He in New Jersey, put a special tax on the ultra wealthy citizens of New Jersey to raise additional funds to, in fact, make those funds available to those hit the hardest. Now, think about that. Those hit the hardest are the essential workers. They're the folks who have provided to all of us the day-to-day work that without which everything would have ground to a halt. Well, because they're out there exposing themselves in ways that many of us are not, they have a higher incidence of getting sick. Well, we as a society need to help those folks. So there are things that we can do, and we see examples of that. But wishful thinking isn't going to contribute to the recovery.
Well, the other thing we saw play out in New Jersey is an uptick in fares here as well. To use a turnpike, to use whatever, and that traditionally wasn't planned, but because of this slowdown, things like that have had to happen, not just in New Jersey, across the U.S. when you think about funding gaps and revenue losses here in taxes due to the pandemic. And on that front, I mean, you think about how a lot of these workers might be impacted. To your point, those that are still working, not completely doing that well either when you think about all the struggles out there. And that's kind of what's caught here in this next round of stimulus, the idea that we would have gotten $1,200 checks again by now, but we haven't. I mean, what's overlooked here, and maybe you can look at the unemployment rate, but the pain being felt by the average worker who still might have a job, but still not in the same economic position they were pre-pandemic?
Well, look, I think what's being overlooked is the need for national and state policies that both address the pandemic in the most realistic way to end it as soon as possible. Again, not through wishful thinking, but through action. And then prepare to support an economic recovery. And there are lots of good things that lie ahead for that economic recovery. As the CEO of Microsoft said recently, there has been an acceleration in the last few months that otherwise would have taken several years in terms of the transition to digital solutions from the old traditional analog work processes. That acceleration is going to affect workers throughout the economy in very positive ways. And they were, again, necessity is mother of invention. We all were working at home. All of a sudden, remote collaboration tools became very important. The ability to conduct business in a very different way. We had to learn how to do that. All of that's bringing a vitality to the economy that will create new opportunities. Out of crisis comes new opportunities. Now's a moment to be actually preparing for that at every level. Big business preparing for how it can play its role. Banks preparing for how it can do more lending for companies that will deserve those funds because they're going to create growth in jobs. Public policy to think today because it takes governments a long time to make anything happen. Let's be ready to create the environment that will foster an economic growth. And there is a lot we can do to, again, create opportunity through technology in significant part, removing the frictions. For example, I believe a small firm today, while it is local, it should go global. It shouldn't think that its market is just its community or even its country, because technology is eliminating the frictions that have historically prevented those smaller firms from competing in the global economy. But today they can do that on the merits, on the basis of their quality and price and performance. And they can get in front of companies all over the world through technology to compete for business. So instead of just thinking that they're a local service provider, they ought to understand that the entire globe is their market. And in that way, we'll make globalization work. In that way, we'll drive its benefits deeper into the world's economies, particularly ours. And in that way, we'll create a more inclusive economy and economic growth with good middle-class jobs.